My lords, ladies, planetary governors, and other humble servants of the auriferous cathedra, it does once again make my heart sing to be able to bring before you one of the most notable culinary delights available anywhere in the million worlds of the galaxy. Now, to those who are today receiving their first delivery of my wares, first of all, permit me to bid you welcome. It has been one of my most ardent desires from the outset to introduce those aspiring to better themselves, to ease their passage into the warm occult of High Gothic society, through a broadening of horizons both culinary and cultural. Rest assured, your subscription will be a key turning in many a door, both gastronomic and social, and will make you the scintillator of any formal gathering worthy of your fine judgment. But any dish or drink, no matter how sublime, is only on a base level mere sustenance, were it not for the context. Much as you may go to dinner at a High Lord's palace and admire the painting on the wall, your enjoyment is enhanced a thousandfold when you recognise it as the work of a master who created such pieces in spite of his ocular degeneracy and crude, ligneous hands. So, the package in front of you contains a dish that is testimony to that philosophy. Much as how a sound mind produces no great art, the most exquisite of tastes can only be brought forth from troubled soil. The contents echo a time where a great enemy came forth. Even the angels of the Emperor himself were almost cast aside. A war in which the survival of what you hold before you hung in the balance. For those who can bear it no longer, please touch the open ruin on your crate and behold. For what follows is the story of the War of the Jadeberry Pie. Those of you new to speaking High Gothic will, by now, I'm sure, have encountered the infamous adjective conjugation tables. These are both as intimidating as they are inspiring, for they mark the moment when the young scholar first begins to realise the true depth of meaning and nuance that is possible with this great language of ours. The rendering of a single simple term in Low Gothic to dozens of individual, intricately and perfectly expressed concepts in High Gothic. Unfortunately, the ease with which text can be translated from High to Low Gothic, and the relative difficulty in translating them the other way, means that sometimes terms that were originally almost poetic can be rendered somewhat clunky through the passage of time and the sad loss of original source materials. Thus, the setting of our scene is Rynn's world, named after the Imperial Reclamator who first charted this system millennia ago, who also graced the system with its nom de stellar, Rynn Star, and in whose honour the capital is named New Rynn City. The chief export of this world is the Jadeberry pie, and I can only suppose that the reason it is called such and not Rynberry pie is because Soldano Malvero Rynn once tasted an uncooked berry and probably decided it was not fit to bear her name. When the time comes to serve the pie that sits before you, and crucially have your servants or servitors bake, not boil the pie in its dish, at 200 degrees for 40 to 50 minutes Imperial Standard, and serve with warm custard. Should you find yourself with only cream available, then, as the Cadian Commissar says of a newborn, it will serve. Now, yes, when the time comes to serve, I guarantee that at least one among your party will remark with surprise and delight that the contents of the pie are not green after all. This is because jadeberries themselves are a botanical curiosity. Their name derives from the colour of the berry's skin, which ranges from a leafy gentle green through the summer months to a rich jade as the fruit ripens. This unusual coloration is understood to be because of a thin layer of chlorophores within the berry that both enable the berries to contribute to the plant's sustenance during the summer months, but also render the berries some level of protection from the planet's fauna. However, the raw berries themselves are extremely bitter and mildly toxic, and it's only when the skin is removed, a painstakingly slow process that is only partially relieved by the use of specialist harvesting machinery, and the berries properly cooked, that the toxins in the berry break down and add to the naturally occurring sugars and cannabinoids that give the pie its distinctive sweet notes and moderate psychoactive effects. More crucially, jadeberries are a food found only on Rynn's world, and as settlers discovered the wondrous properties of the berry and word of the exquisite jadeberry pie spread, more and more voices came to call for something to be done to ensure the protection of this crown among foods. Words that were ultimately heeded. For you see, Rynn's world is unique amongst agri worlds in that it is home to an entire chapter of the Adeptus Astartes. The history of any Space Marine chapter is a rich and storied thing. Put simply, a lifetime of thrusting oneself into what are, almost by definition, situations deemed beyond the capacity of mortal humans to overcome, will lead to the accruing of honours, victories, unusual happenstances, and the inevitable tall tales with almost embarrassing frequency. Unsurprisingly then, most chapters' home fortresses, or flagships, will contain an extensive and ever-growing archive dedicated solely to their own exploits, and even a passing familiarity with any chapter's lore will produce an awful arsenal of anecdotes. This does mean that members of the Astartes can make for somewhat difficult dinner companions because they are a lot. That said, the history of the Crimson Fist chapter is, by Astartes standards, far less well known and recorded in vastly less detail than even the oral tradition of the Vilica Fenrica, for reasons that will become all too apparent as our story unfolds. What is known is that the Fists are one of the successor chapters to the original Space Marine legions, brought about by the, in some cases, reluctant sundering of the legions of old into smaller tactical bodies that would present less of a threat individually, at least at an Imperium scale. The Crimson Fists, unsurprisingly, were originally part of the Imperial Fists, and much of their heraldry, chapter traditions and artifacts trace back to that legion and, by extension, its Primarch, Rogel Dawn. For much of its history, the chapter was a fleet-based crusade force, existing in the quiet, calm space and only setting foot on planets to either wage war or recruit new inductii. However, by the will and wisdom of the Emperor, a happy confluence of events came together. The chapter, having run great honours in the Voltigern Crusade, and thus being due to receive a larger official fief to call their own, and at the same time the growing need to ensure the production of jadeberries to ease the stresses of the Imperium's myriad nobility, brought the two together naturally enough. The chapter's flagship, Rutalis Tyrannus, was honourably dismembered, its armour, weapons and power systems forming the skeleton upon which their new fortress monastery, Arx Tyrannus, in the eastern Hellblade Mountains of the planet's largest continent, was built. The transition to becoming a planet-based chapter brought certain challenges. Typically, Space Marine homeworlds are carefully selected to produce a ready supply of potential recruits both for elevation to full Astartes and as the numerous mortal aids that perform much of the unsung labour that enables an Astartes chapter to function. Often this drives chapters to establish their fortress monasteries on death worlds, or at least planets where the climate, flora and fauna present at least a moderate risk to life on a daily basis. Rynn's world is, or was, almost the complete opposite. A green-blue gem of a world that, although it has its less hospitable places in the polar ice caps or mountain ranges, much of the land is lush, subtropical or temperate, with an abundance of arable land and mostly unlethal rainforest. So instead, the Fists make an annual pilgrimage to the death ward of Blackwater for gathering suitably hardy recruits. All of which means the relationship between the human and post-human populations of Rynn's world is an unusual one, lacking the usual bonds of blood and superstition that develop on most chapters' homeworlds. On the Rynnite side, the Fists were both seen as protectors and a blessed presence of the Emperor's will, but combined with a sort of tension of wishing to avoid the outright worship or adulation of less developed planets. On the side of the Fists, well, who can really claim to understand the thinking of the Emperor's finest, but what is well established is that they mostly kept to themselves in their fortress of solitude, amidst the Hellblades, only really coming into contact with the rest of Rynn's world for matters of military significance or where formality demanded it. It is at this point in our tale that along comes a spider. You see, while I'm sure some of you will have been calling for Encartographicas and luggage orders, there are some things that render Rynn's world something less than an ideal location for a well-earned sabbatical. First and foremost, its relative remoteness from the trade routes of the Imperium does not mean that the world is in a galactic backwater. On the contrary, it sits uncomfortably close to a region of space where good people fear to tread, and which is held, for some values of that word, by an ever-shifting tapestry of orcish warlords. The time of this particular tale was during the ascendancy of one such warlord, Snagrod, the somewhat eponymous arch-arsonist. Now, a quick note to those amongst my subscribers who spend their days in uniforms. Whilst I would never dream of dismissing the brutality of the Greenskins, it is worth taking any of the monikers with a pinch of salt. I'm aware of no evidence indicating that Snagrod was any more prone to the use of fire as a weapon than any other orc. Indeed, any such stylings appear to be a kind of wordplay that many would assume beyond the brainpower of most Greenskins. Which is to say, their names broadly declare simply, unlike these other orcs, I solve my problems through violence. Indeed, there is some evidence among those who dirty their hands and minds with the machinations of orcish politics that the title may not have originated nor perished with Snagrod, and is in fact somewhat hereditary, with the title passing on to whichever war boss holds sway in the sector at any given time. In any case, the pieces were in play. Snagrod was ascendant, and slowly but surely he drew his war against us. The first anyone knew of Snagrod's ambitions was a distress signal from the planet of Badlanding, another name that one hopes was less on the nose in its original High Gothic. The small Astra Militarum garrison there had been swiftly overtaken by a massive orcish force that arrived seemingly completely without warning and overwhelmed the world's defences. Evidently the orcs had gathered in sufficient numbers to venture beyond their usual domains and encroach on Imperial space. This is a perennial problem for the Imperium's armed forces, and has led to a problem some have described as akin to mowing a lawn, a routine endeavour that, if left too long, becomes all the more difficult. For the Astartes of the Crimson Fists, this had proved an effective strategy in the past. While no detailed records exist, it is understood that through occasional well-placed decapitation strikes and other military operations, multiple budding wars had been nipped in the bud, reducing the Xenos masses into bickering and infighting in the resultant power vacuum. It is likely that when the distress call from Badlanding was received, that Chapter Master Pedro Cantor anticipated just such an operation. As it was, the Fist dispatched a roughly company-sized force to the planet, with the official intention of assisting survivors of the Greenskin invasion, in addition to performing reconnaissance and taking whatever military action seemed appropriate. It goes almost without saying that none expected there to be any survivors remaining after the several weeks voyage it would take the Fist ship to navigate the warp passage. What exactly transpired once the Crimson Fist strike force arrived at Badlanding is known in full only to the Fists themselves, and, perhaps unsurprisingly, they are not keen to dispense the gory details. Not that the details really matter, for the outcome could bear no hiding. Upon translating back into the Rynn star system, the returning forces reported two things most urgently. First was that Rynn's world must at once be placed on a war footing and brace for the unthinkable, a direct orcish invasion of Astartes' homeworld. As if to underline the severity of the situation, the returning Marines also brought grave tidings. The company captain, Ashur Draken, had fallen in battle, along with 2/3 of the original strike force. It is a sad truth of war that the need for action leaves little time for consideration, and for mourning the dead. Indeed, the tension of brutal practicality over base human emotion could almost be seen as characteristic of the Rynn's World campaign. As it was, the lost were marked, the hymns sung, the rites of passing observed, but in the background feet pounded on ferrocrete, engines were fired, guns were loaded, and a planet made ready. Junior chefs often make the mistake of thinking that flavour is all that matters when creating a new dish. They underestimate the full complexity of the dining experience. Of course there is texture, colour, aroma, but also attention must be paid to the up and down swings of the palate. The need to vary intensity and give the diner's mouth time to recover from an intense flavour with another softer one. Although there are some who would disagree, I maintain that you cannot simply overload every dish with spices and call it done. Likewise, when considering invasion preparations, Chapter Master Cantor had to balance how to distribute his forces. Spread too thin and they would suffer for lack of tactical flexibility and support. Too concentrated and they rendered themselves vulnerable to encirclement. Worse, they risked leaving key locations vulnerable. In the end, it was decided that while the majority of the chapter would remain in their stronghold Arx Tyrannus, a sizable force would be dispatched to garrison the planet's capital, New Rynn City. It was here that the first cracks began to show in the relationship between the Marines and the human population. Second Company Captain Alves gave explicit instructions that, to enable a rapid deployment, the Crimson Fist forces travelling into New Rynn City should arrive essentially unannounced, and that the Rynsguard Planetary Defence Forces were not to observe any formal reception on pain of death. At New Rynn Spaceport, the Captain's Thunderhawk was met on arrival by an honour guard of 1,000 soldiers in full dress uniforms. Worse, upon entering the city, the Fist found the streets thronged with the citizenry tossing bundles of red and blue flowers beneath the tracks of their tanks, seemingly too caught up in the spectacle of finally seeing those aloof beings from high in the mountains, or at least with that being foremost in their minds, rather than thinking too deeply on what circumstances would have necessitated their presence in the city in such numbers. Ultimately, to the best of my knowledge, nobody was put to death for the flouting of Captain Alves' instructions, although a senior government minister suffered moderate injuries after being thrown from a bridge into the Edasian River. At this point, I'm afraid I need to digress into a brief recap of elementary astronavigation. Now, translating between real space and the warp is typically performed at a star system's Mandeville points. These are locations sufficiently far from a star and any of its planets or other large masses. The curvature of space-time is flat. This greatly reduces the complexity of the associated calculations and minimises the physical stresses on a vessel as it performs the remarkable feat of punching a small hole through the fabric of reality. Crucially, Mandeville points aren't the only places where this could be done. The interactions of gravitational fields produce bumps, eddies, and small locations of relative stability, such as the leading or trailing Lagrange points of large planetary masses. The reason that nobody makes use of these is that they are substantially smaller than the Mandeville points, and are vastly more difficult to locate on account of being continually moved by the motion of a star, its planets, and everything else in the system big enough to cause gravitational ripples. Translating into real space to the Lagrange point would place any ship at huge risk, with even a small misalignment placing the vessel under tremendous stresses. It is something a captain may try under desperate circumstances and reasonably expect to die. Translating an entire fleet this way would be beyond madness. And that is where the Crimson Fists miscalculated. The naval forces available to protect Rynn's world had been spread into a vast picket line hundreds of thousands of kilometres across, with the expectation that they could manoeuvre to their best advantage in the several days that it would take Orcish forces to travel in system from the Mandeville points. So instead, when a vast greenskin force began translating from the L1 and L2 points of Rynn's world's largest moon, the defenders found themselves both outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Dozens of Orc ships were torn apart from translation forces, but still more of them survived, pouring into real space. The combined Astartes and local naval fleets of course fought valiantly, but even under ideal circumstances they were outnumbered on a simply staggering level. Ship after ship made it through the blockade and descended to the planet, the entry streaks setting the sky ablaze like flashes from some titanic fiery whip. Meanwhile, the forces on the ground, and in particular those remaining in the Fist's Fortress Monastery, were doing one of the most painful things when a battle is raging. They were waiting. Protected by the fortress's void shields, the Fists were able to shrug off the Orcs' orbital bombardment, which was itself somewhat cursory. The promise of violence and bloodshed leaves little room in greenskin thinking for such things as tactical delay. So any bombardment that did occur had to do so alongside the landing of countless ships across the plains of the Archelan Basin, a vast rolling sweep of fertile land that spanned the planet's largest continent and lay between the Hellblade Mountains and the Dantine coast. The green fields and rolling steppe that had been familiar, safe home for so many was now enemy territory, a hunting ground for creatures that know only violence, predators loose amongst livestock. All too soon, the space war was fully lost. The last of the Astartes ships trying to punch their way through the Orc fleet and gain enough distance from the planet to dive into the warp. The bombardment eased, and at last, the Fists were able to make some response. Arx Tyrannus' location atop the Hellblades made it immensely defensible from a ground assault. But the harsh geography also meant that certain compromises had to be made in its construction. As such, the fortress lacked the laser defence installations that formed the backbone of planetary defences for many other fortresses across the Imperium. Instead, their main tool for orbital attack was in the form of great rocket-propelled missiles, the so-called ship killers. As the Orcs turned their attention from bombardment to simply flooding the planet with landing craft, Arx Tyrannus dropped its void shields and began its retaliation, with the first of the missiles lumbering their way skyward. As for what came next, well, the exact course of events remains the subject of some debate. Potential explanations ranging from some kind of gross engineering fault during the fortress's construction through to most foul sabotage. The truth, ultimately, lies with those who were there and from whom no testimony can ever be given. The official series of events states that a critical fault in a ship killer's missile guidance system saw it swerve wildly off course immediately after liftoff. Without having fully cleared the fortress or its surrounding peaks, its trajectory instead inverted and drove the armour-penetrating warhead tip deep into the rock's ceramite and plasteel of Arx Tyrannus itself. The warhead penetrated deep enough into the mountain that when it detonated, shockwaves broke through into one of the fortress's magazines, producing in the course of microseconds a flurry of secondary explosions that ripped rock and metal, bonded ceramite and flesh and bone, and engulfed them all in blinding, brilliant light. In less time than it takes to tell, Arx Tyrannus ceased to exist. And for the defenders of New Rynn City, the night of the burning sky grew briefly even brighter, as light spilled over the horizon from the east, a midnight sunrise in ghostly nuclear white. And in the vast gulf of darkness between, the night was filled with fire, and the roaring of machines, and the whooping of alien throats, and human screams. Dark indeed was the day, but our tale does not end here. In fact, there is still much to relate, but my throat grows too dry for the telling, so our conclusion must wait for another time. Now, before signing off, I'm afraid that due to the ongoing crisis in the servitor market, once again I am forced to address the price of these subscription services, and from next cycle, please ensure payment is adjusted to 12,500 thrones Imperial Standard. As always, hard currency or readily fungible assets are strongly preferred and will receive a 5% discount.